And for those of you that I haven't had the chance to meet, I'm Kathleen Osher, Director of Community Services for the City of Littleton. I have been managing the Envision Littleton process over the last 3 years, and we have a great team at the city that's worked on this, and we're really pleased to continue our work with Candid Keys Collaborative. So, Brett, I think you're ready to start for this evening, so I'll turn it over to Brett Keast with Candid Keys Collaborative. You're on
Hear me,
mute.
Brett.
I just unmuted myself. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Please, we have a good group for this Envision Studio number 4. So for those of you who are returning, welcome back. I'm glad to see all of you again. For those of you that may be joining us for the first time, welcome to you as well. We have 90 minutes set aside this evening, and we're going to really focus our attention on the content of the presentation as a follow-up to our last Envision Studio. So everybody can see the agenda okay, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time talking about the outcomes from our last Envision Studio and a little bit more about how they apply. And I think you'll see as we go through this presentation that we've taken what we've heard and we're starting to infuse that into our ideas about how this section of the Unified Land Use Code will be drafted. From there, we will spend about 50 minutes really talking through a lot of the details. We've developed a lot of illustrations that kind of help convey some of the points that we have and some of the ways that we can go about writing standards and regulating new development to meet the community's expectations. So we'll talk through kind of the existing zoning and then what's planned or proposed. We'll talk about some of the regulatory standards and land uses. A new term, for those of you that were involved in downtown, you probably understand the concept of frontage types. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, of course, looking at the illustrations. We've set aside the last 30 minutes as just kind of an open community conversation. So we're recording this and we'll be taking notes through that point to hear any thoughts or ideas that any of you have for that part of the evening. So I'm going to present just a quick overview of what I learned from the session that I facilitated during our last Envision Studio, which was entitled Perspectives and Preferences. And admittedly, I was not able to capture everything that was said, but the essence of what was said. We talked a lot about there being a need for better connections and access to light rail. There's examples in town where there's developments that could probably do a better job of making connections and the orientation of the development to rail so that we can really start to create true transit-oriented development. We talked about building on the opportunities for all the different transit routes and potential future transit routes, whether that be bus rapid transit or whatever that might be in the future of creating development that will really lend itself well to transit. We talked about building design and how that contributes to character. We looked at a shopping center that had some sloped roofs and everybody thought that that was attractive and gives a little different appearance than kind of a more contemporary flat roof buildings. Parking obviously is very, very important as to where it's located, how it's designed and broken up. Talked a lot about pedestrians moving in and around sites and to sites and creating connections to the city's trail network. On the idea of sustainability, we talked about low impact development, and we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight, of looking at some examples of how that can be integrated into site design. And then managing access, of course, is important, and just thinking about overall landscape and greenscape on a site. So those were, again, some of the high points that we talked about with that session. I'm now going to ask Brian if he would elaborate a little bit more about the session that he did on the ground, where he utilized the mapping tool that we have on the project website.
Yeah, we had
Right?
a mapping tool. Yeah, we had a mapping tool where people could drop virtual pins, as you can see on the map that's on the screen now, and put comments along with those pins at specific locations that are part of this area that we're looking at. Some of the things that came out of our discussion were the thought of expanding the characteristics of downtown and the uses and design of a typical downtown, and of Littleton, specifically downtown west of Santa Fe. Another element that came out of our conversation was to preserve the older houses that are along Littleton Boulevard. Looked at and talked about opportunities for transit-oriented development, the TOD there on the screen, and a mobility hub where there would be several, multiple types of transit options, more kind of over on the east side. Talked about and tagged underutilized properties that would be good for redevelopment and infill development and more mixing of uses. And one other thing we talked about were opportunities for bike path connections and improvements where they currently exist and where they could exist in the future.
Okay. And Jennifer?
So I'm going to summarize in the details, and this was one that myself and Mike Sutherland hosted at the last Envision Studio. And what we heard from people as we were asking these questions, can I remind everyone to mute themselves just so we don't have that feedback? Thank you. So in the details presentation, we did building step backs. We talked about that, and that really helps address concerns for heightened transitioning. On building design, materials, and interaction, the building design and materials are very important with how the building interacts with the street. So those definitely need to be taken into consideration. For site design, we took a look at pedestrian treatments, overall walkability, and location of the building on a site, and how that impacts how people feel when they're next to a building. One of the things that also impacts how they feel is the amount and location of parking. And that was a huge determinant of character, whether it felt walkable or not walkable or more suburban, auto-oriented. Again, the high quality building materials was stressed quite often during our discussion, especially when it came to Littleton Boulevard. And then along the corridors, we staff asked the question, should all of our corridors be treated the same? And the answer was a resounding no, that they each have their own distinct character and should reflect that in the way they are designed, the way streetscape is laid out, the way parking is laid out, and the way buildings are laid out. One thing that did come up along all the corridors is limiting the amount of curb cuts or access points onto the corridors would help further the character of each of these corridors. So I guess, Mike Sutherland, did I miss anything?
No, that was a good summary, Jen.
Okay. And Kathleen, you want to talk about the economics of land use session?
Yes, I think we have the same note as every other session. We wish we had more time, right? I think that was the universal takeaway that many of the groups had with our small group discussions. We talked about the variety of goals that the city has. Of course, there are land use goals, transportation and infrastructure goals, but there are also the economics that have to be considered as we kind of step through this process. So we, unlike many of our peer cities, are very reliant on sales tax, which means that lack of funding diversity means we have to think about the short term and the long term in terms of the financing of or the financial impact and fiscal impact of any given project. We know that land is one of the greatest assets that we do have as a city. We don't own much of it as a city. It's mostly in private ownership, but we did have some conversation about growing the right way. I think this was a very consistent theme going through the comprehensive plan. We often said we were in the process of looking at best practices and finding ways to sort of Littletonize those. The areas of focus that we heard during our discussion were green, eco-friendly, sustainable, leveraging those transportation options, particularly when there was connection for transit-oriented type development, either along bus corridors or light rail, of which we have 2 stations. And then also looking at that revenue generation piece for each of those developments.
Okay. Thank you. So that was a synopsis of what we heard, and I get these were all summarized, and that report will be on the Envision Littleton website, and I believe there is the recordings of those as well. Just as a reminder, we broke the city in the area of the city down into 4 building blocks, as many of you know. We went over downtown, and that resulted in the phase 2 changes to the ordinance, which resulted in a lot of additions to the zoning ordinance as it is today. And then since we have transitioned into what will be drafting the Unified Land Use Code, and the first building block area that we're looking at. So this shows the map of all the different building blocks. And this evening, we're going to be looking at the building block for the corridors and mixed use areas, which are those that are shown here in purple. Essentially, the vast majority of frontage along the city's major arteries. So that is the area that we're focusing on tonight. The next building block will be looking at neighborhoods. So that will happen beginning early in the spring, after the first of the year. So just looking at the zoning map of the city, this is the existing zoning district. So by and large, any district that's in the city is somewhere along this corridor. So I wanted to just give a very brief summary of those zoning districts. The T district now, and I'll be going through and showing each of these to you and where they are in the community as we look through each of these districts. But this district is basically for homes and homes that have been converted into businesses, maybe some live work or home-based businesses. And then as you progress from B1 to B2 to B3, basically increasing levels of intensity, broader mixtures of land uses, and more significance as you go up that ladder. And then there are a whole series of planned development, residential, commercial, and industrial, and an overlay district. There are several of those around town that are kind of in and of themselves, kind of unique districts that have a site development plan with them. And then there's also some industrially zoned property along these corridors. And again, we'll be going through each of these as we progress through the presentation. And taking a look at those and starting to think about how that could unroll into the Unified Land Use Code. So we're identifying the proposed or planned new districts on the far left-hand column there. So we decided to keep the transition district, just maybe calling it a transition residential. Again, a lot of the properties along Littleton Boulevard that were once homes, very much residential in character, even though some of them are now being used or occupied for businesses. That contributes significantly to the character along that corridor. That would be retained with some modifications, and we'll go through those. The B1 district would be basically an NB or neighborhood business, which is essentially what it is today. We'll be taking a look at the different land uses within those and making adjustments, but basically this is supposed to be those districts that are lesser intensity and maybe abutting or in close proximity to neighborhoods, and they would not necessarily disrupt the neighborhood fabric because of their scale and sensitivity to those neighborhoods. We consolidated the B2 and B3 districts into a GB or general business. And we might look at some of the land uses, maybe in the B3, of creating some conditions for those just to make sure that they are treated appropriately within their contexts. The MU or the mixed use district is a lot of what we've been talking about. That would be a new district but basically taking what today are the planned development residential and commercial and getting the same outcomes that you've been getting with a planned development, but doing it without having a planned development per se, having better building and site design standards, building materials and things of that nature. So we can consolidate many of those PD districts into a single mixed use base district. And then introducing a public and institutional district, which would be for all the public city, county buildings and other types of semi-public buildings that could be included within that district. So that's kind of a lineup of what we're thinking at this point for the districts for this area. Now looking at the transition district, these are all found along Littleton Boulevard. So everything that's highlighted in blue there are what are currently zoned T or transition. And again, I think many of you will recognize that a lot of these are very small scale. A lot of them were once homes that have become small businesses. We're very much interested in retaining the residential and appearance, since many of them directly butt still single family occupied homes, either beside or directly to the rear of them. The standards that are in the district right now, you can see those listed. If I go to the next slide, some of those are really probably either hard to achieve or we don't want to achieve them based on what's currently zoned. So for instance, a floor area ratio, a 1.0 floor area ratio would allow a building to cover an entire site from property line to property line, or a 2-story building for half the site, or a 3-story building for a third of the site. So that can become very intense. So we are thinking that it might be more of a 0.6 FAR. I'm having a 30-foot height, which is the same as the height in the adjacent residential districts, lessening the density of any residential types of uses, just again, because of the scale and the height and the limitations in this district. Ratcheting up the amount of pervious area, it's now 25%. We're thinking about 35%, so that we can maintain some of the front yards and have other pervious areas so that they blend in well with the surrounding residential uses. And then I'll be talking to you about the frontage types. What I mean by that is where the building is located on the site and relative to the street, whether the building's brought forward, whether it's pushed to one side, whether it's pushed back with parking in front or green space in front. So we'll be going over those frontage types. And then we'll be looking very closely at all the land uses to make sure that the land uses that are in these current districts are appropriate, whether they should or they should not remain within this district, or if there are certain districts that may require some limitations, restrictions, or conditions to make sure that they maybe have a higher level of review so that they blend in well with the context of its location. We also know along Littleton Boulevard that there are quite a number of historic mid-modern historical buildings. You can see a couple images here. There was an inventory done along this corridor. There were a total of 77 surveyed properties, and then many of them were broken out into tiers 1 through 4. So we're very sensitive to those and recognize that the sites of some of these maybe don't fit the standards perfectly. So we'll have to think about how these are well integrated so that we are able to retain the integrity of some of these existing properties. The next district was the B1 neighborhood district. Again, you can see a big concentration of those on Littleton Boulevard on the eastern part over towards Broadway. And then there's a few others that are kind of located, as you can see, circled there. Again, you see the standards and some of the proposed standards. Since this is a district that is supposed to be nestled in and amongst and adjacent to neighborhoods, and it's supposed to be of a design character that does not create major impacts, sensitivity and the transitioning of these uses is very, very important. So lessening the current floor area that's in the zoning ordinance from 1.0 to 0.45. And I know that's kind of hard to understand what that exactly means, but if you look at it in relative terms, thinking that 1.0 would be a building, single-story building that covers an entire lot. We're talking about half of that. So we think that that's important to maintain this character. Again, keeping the height to maybe 30 feet. There's some variability that could happen on certain sites depending on context and location and the size of the property. But as a rule, and then again, setbacks based on frontage type. And I'll have some questions for you. We have a total of 15 questions that we'll be asking you here momentarily. So that's one of the mechanisms that we'll be doing to get some of your input. We'll be reporting the results of those as we go, as we have in some of the previous studio sessions. Some of these may be called into question. For instance, hotels and motels. Might that be replaced with maybe more of a bed and breakfast inn, something that's much larger in scale, more boutique, as opposed to just, open-ended hotel motels. So we'll be talking through those as we go about writing, and of course, we'll be presenting those to you at a later date. So we look at the what we're proposing is to change the B1 into a neighborhood business district. We already kind of went through the standards. Let me see here. So here's like a good example along the north side of Littleton Boulevard of a couple of properties that exist that have been there for quite some time, the Doctor's Care Building and then the Pyramid Liquor, that you can see there's a great discrepancy in terms of how the site was laid out and designed. And the one on the left is probably more like what we're after, where they have retained the front yards. You have a green front yard, nice, pleasant access to a sidewalk directly with the parking to the rear. The parking's very well laid out, has some buffers. It probably could be landscaped more, but as opposed to the site to the east of it, that is essentially all paved and not very much in terms of distinguishing parking areas or creating any internal or even peripheral landscaping. So that's kind of a good example of the types of things that we're going to be looking at as we're drafting regulations. So I'll ask the first question here, and Brian will be posting up the poll, I believe. Correct, Brian? So the first one is, should the zoning along Littleton Boulevard be changed due to the character of this corridor? There is currently, kind of where Littleton Boulevard is on the map, there's a lot of B2 zoning, which allows for much bigger, more intense uses. So we're giving you an option there of, should the zoning ultimately along Littleton Boulevard be changed? So I'll give you a moment there to read through those and to provide your response.
This is Brian. Is everyone seeing the poll question? I haven't seen anyone answer yet. Okay.
Everybody able to see it?
Yeah, we can see it. I don't know if we can answer it though, because the submit doesn't really come through. I don't know if that's coming out or not.
I don't think you can submit until you've answered all of them. Yep, exactly.
Answer all the questions before you can submit.
Yeah, so Brett, they have to, they can't submit until they've answered all 3 questions. So I don't know if you wanted to show the visual for the next 2 questions as well at the same time.
Okay. So the next 2
there's not a,
questions
okay.
are now on the screen.
And we're roughly at about 60% responses so far of people who've answered.
Brian, I think I submitted, I think I hit end result.
Okay.
My questions disappeared as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say they're gone.
Okay. if I relaunch it, it's going to delete the answers I think that were given.
I
Um,
think, I don't know. I was just
Okay.
literally on a number.
Why don't we go ahead and relaunch just to make sure that we get a good sampling of
Okay.
everybody?
I'm going to go ahead and relaunch. So if you answered already, can you please answer again? Just a second. Okay.
For about 62% have voted thus far. We'll give about another 20 seconds or so for everybody to please vote. Okay, Brian, looks like everybody has voted. You want to share the results?
Can you see those, Brett?
I can, yes, but I'm not
Okay.
sure if everybody else is able to.
Yeah, I don't know if Zoom lets participants see the results, but they will be, memorialized.
Can everybody see them on my
Yes.
screen?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So, very interesting results. These are going to help immensely as we really understand how stakeholders view these corridors and what you see as being important or less important. So that's going to be very, very helpful. Thank you for your response. Okay. So the B2 and B3 areas are proposed to be joined together into a single district. So the B2 districts, you can see them shown on the map now. And you can see the standards in the current zoning ordinance and just a few of the land uses that are provided for. I've added a few asterisks to the end of those just to kind of highlight some of the things that stand out as being important in the current ordinance and maybe some uses that there could be greater sensitivities than others along some of the corridors, depending upon context, of course. And the B3, the land uses are nearly identical. A lot of the standards are nearly identical. And you can see there are fewer B3 districts than there are B2. So again, we were combining the B2 and the B3 into a single GB or general business district. This would provide for obviously a much broader range of land uses. There could be a lot of the different building types. If you recall from downtown, we had commercial and office buildings and institutional parking structures. We'll be going through the the frontage types, and then looking also at some of the standards. There is no current height. We would be establishing a height. It could be based upon context as to where that lot is relevant to buildings and their height or a neighborhood or what have you. Potentially increasing the amount of pervious area on a site. So we get good area for both low impact development as well as landscaping and buffering, things of that nature. So here is a fourth poll question. Ryan, if you would please post that up as well. So if everybody can please vote on this, should properties along Broadway that directly abut single family be zoned to transition residential or neighborhood business instead of general business? For about 2/3 voting complete. Another 15 seconds. Okay. Brian, you want to publish the results? Everybody can see the results now. So 45% said yes, as they redevelop, they should be more suitable. And then no was tied at 25 apiece. So we're pretty much 50-50 in terms of the overall yes or no. So that still gives us good input as to the type of transitioning and other improvements that would be necessary for any sensitivities of edges between different districts or different intensities of use. Okay. Again, there are some light and heavy industrial properties that are along the corridor, as you can see indicated here. Those also have no height limit. There's no minimum lot area, and there's only 10% open space. There are some setbacks when adjacent to districts other than industrial districts. There's a 25-foot. And then there's quite a lot of different types of land uses, including some commercial uses permitted in the industrial, which given their location is perhaps not bad, but we can talk more about that. So again, starting to look at some of the standards and what could be accomplished on these properties, given heights, given the amount of parking that would require, given the amount of pervious area, that reaching a 3.0 floor area ratio would be difficult. Height limit, again, I think this would be based upon context. So depending on where it lies within the corridor and sensitivities. Open spaces, if we were to increase the amount of pervious area on site and make sure that we have dense buffers around properties. So that's some of the thoughts and ideas that we have for possibly adjusting some of the setbacks. Again, going through each of the land uses and making sure that they can be appropriate in all cases, or perhaps they require additional level of review to make sure that they are appropriate. The next 3 poll questions. Ryan, if you would please post those. About a third of the way complete with responses. Two-thirds complete. Okay, about 15 more seconds. Okay, Brian, if you would like to close and show the results. So the majority thought industrial properties should be rezoned to more appropriate districts and uses. It might change over time. We're kind of split between the concerns that there are with the location of industrial districts along these corridors, from their appearance to the environmental impacts. And let me see, just inappropriate and unsightly uses, I guess, is the highest vote category. And then what is the most important regulation for best managing industrial uses? Looks like environmental performance standards is number one, followed by creating buffer yards proportional to the level of impact. Again, very helpful. Thank you. Okay.
And Brett, you may need to reshare your screen.
Okay.
In my attempt to turn off annotation, I think I may have stopped sharing your slides.
Okay. Is it back on now?
Yes.
Okay. So the planned development properties, again, there are quite a number of those. You can see them indicated on the map. For those of you that are familiar, these are properties that are individually approved by review and approval or adoption of specific plans for these properties. In the ordinance today, there are different sub-districts for residential, commercial, and industrial properties and uses. And again, we were proposing that some of these could become mixed-use properties. One of the things that we're going to be looking at is procedurally, how do we handle planned developments in the future? There's a number of different ways that can happen. One would be that we simply leave them as is. Their planned development, their plans that are associated with each of these are already in place. Of course, there is a history with them, but we could not allow any future PDs, replacing them with a mixed-use district that will still require a plan, but doesn't go to the level of a planned development. They just be a lot more specific development standards. Again, we're proposing to merge the planned development, commercial and residential districts into a mixed-use district. Potentially can consolidate some of the industrial districts and write standards for those. And one of the things that we're after with this entire project is just making the land use code easier to use, more straightforward, easier to follow. And if we can establish fewer districts, there can be fewer applications, fewer public hearings, less time for everybody involved. So there can be a lot of advantages there for both applicants, staff, as well as commission and council members as well. So we'll be evaluating that closer as we get further into this. Here are questions 8 and 9. Again, there are 15 in total. So if everybody please read over those. About 1/3 complete. Two-thirds complete. About another 15 seconds. Five more seconds. Okay, Brian, if you can share the results, please. What is the greatest value of planned development districts? To this point, it's been the best way to get quality standards and quality developments, and the ability to bring a development plan back through the process if there are any changes is also seen as an advantage. How might they be more efficiently managed? Consolidate them into a mixed use district with a master development plan was 62% of the responses. All right, thank you for those responses. As I mentioned, we have already started the process of going through and looking at a lot of the individual land uses. This is just kind of a quick example of going through those and starting to add additional land uses to make sure that they are clarified. There's some land uses that are no longer applicable, others that need to be better defined, and then putting all those into the appropriate district as to where they might be permitted or conditional, or if they're an accessory or temporary use. So again, this is illustrative only, but just kind of showing that this process is underway and trying to make clear the land use standards. We are continuing on similar to the way that was done for downtown in having a table that identifies the different building types that are appropriate within each of the different districts. And then for each building type, there will be a table with the associated standards and graphics that help to illustrate how those standards apply. So that will be something similar for those of you that were involved in the downtown. There will be similar regulations for the corridor mixed use districts. This is a new concept they wanted to explain quickly. Frontage types. Again, this is thinking about where a building is located on a site. Today, in a lot of the districts, there are either 0 setbacks or there are minimum setbacks. If there is a minimum setback, as long as an applicant meets that minimum, they can really set the building wherever they want to. In many cases, they put the building to the far back of the site, and everything between the building and the street frontage is parking lot. Strip centers and malls and big boxes traditionally has been the way they have developed. So we're looking at some alternatives where you can bring the building closer to the front. There could be some amount of parking in the front, limited, with the rest of the parking to the side, to the rear. What's represented here is the dark gray would be a building footprint. The lighter gray would be areas that would be potential for parking. And then the green would be, green space or pervious areas. There could also be, a drive-through, again, with some parking in front to allow that use to function properly, with most of the parking to the side, to the rear. You can bring the building clear to the front property line and have a maximum setback rather than a minimum setback, surrounded by green space, and put all the parking to the rear. If there is a campus type development, you can have buildings scattered across the site and have green space around each of them, and have parking broken up into smaller parking lots or even structures. A development or a commercial center, instead of having it to the back of the property with all the parking in front, you could break that building up into smaller footprints and bring them to the front and the side property line, again, shielding all the parking from the street behind them or even to the side in terms of access. mixed use development, you can have a variety of different uses and building types. I'll be showing you some graphic illustrations of these as we proceed. And then a shop might be something more like what you would see along Littleton Boulevard, where you might have a house. Maybe there's a current garage or something that's converted, again, with parking primarily to the rear, but with a large green space in front. So these would be looking at the different frontage types and how they apply within each of the different districts. I know this is kind of a lot to take on in a short period of time. So some of the questions that I have here are from these and your understanding of those. Which of these frontage type do you think would be best along Littleton Boulevard? And in this case, you can choose more than one. So they can look at the graphics to kind of get an idea of how each of those lay out and give us your thoughts. Keep in mind, some of them have parking in the front yard, others, the parking is handled to the side or to the rear. About a third of the way complete. About 2/3 complete. Another 15, 20 seconds. Okay. Brian, if you'd like to close the poll. Okay, so these are interesting. And of course, we'll be looking at these compared to some of the other responses. There are a lot that kind of stand out. Looks like primarily people see drive-throughs being less suitable. Other types of uses that generally bring the building to the front or have parking to the side and the rear are viewed as being more important along this corridor, as well as providing for some mixed use. All very helpful. Okay, we're going to do the same exact thing for the Bellevue corridor. A third of the way complete. Two-thirds complete. Okay, about 5 more seconds. Okay, Brian, please share the results. So along Bellevue, more people thinking the drive-throughs are appropriate. Mixed use was the #1 response. The center, again, like a shopping center, breaking it into smaller buildings, and bringing it to the front of the site. And then corridor allows for some parking in front, but majority of it to the rear. Okay, starting to paint a picture for us. Okay, same thing for the Broadway corridor. About half done. Okay, 5 more seconds. Okay, Brian? Mixed use again is number 1. Center and corridor are still ranking high as well as the corner. Okay. Very good. And then one last one here, we'll also be looking at the Santa Fe corridor. There's much different character along that corridor. Brian, if you'd launch that poll, please.
Just a moment.
There we go. All right. There we go. Okay. %50 complete. Okay, nearing completion, about 10 more seconds. All right, Brian. Again, mixed use is very highly ranked. Campus, I think this is the first time that it's really jumped out as being the number 2, where we have a lot of green space and buildings it's kind of scattered across the site. And then corridor and drive-through again made itself more present along the Santa Fe corridor. All right. So we just wanted to emphasize transit obviously is something that we're looking very closely at, looking at the current transit lines and the ridership, where obviously the largest ridership along the light rail line, but transit along Broadway at Littleton Boulevard is kind of the next most popular in terms of ridership. So those present your TOD opportunities. So we're looking very closely at the development form in those locations. And then starting to look at some of the studies that were done along Littleton Boulevard, for instance. The graphic's a little fuzzy here, but you can see that's essentially brought all the buildings to the front and put parking to the rear. A lot of what we're talking about here, bringing buildings to the corner, being sensitive to the walkability and the character of that corridor. So this is kind of an interesting site. Once again, this is actually on Powers, just north of Littleton Boulevard, but looking at different conditions on an intersection where you have some buildings that are brought clear to the street, others have green space, and then yet others where the parking is the dominant physical feature. So we'd be looking for, development outcomes based on what we're hearing that is more representative of probably the 2 northern properties as opposed to particularly the southeast property. So this is kind of an illustration at looking at homes along what could be Littleton Boulevard. We maintain the residential architecture. We keep the front yards. We activate the building frontages so that we have front doors and porches and other pedestrian gathering areas in the front with sidewalks, and placing all of the parking to the rear, and then utilizing areas. This is kind of the first time we've really illustrated a buffer yard along the back where we can have berms and we can have a mixture of different types of trees and shrubs and ornamental trees. So we have a good year-round solid barrier separating what has become commercial use from the adjacent residential use. This is an example now along Santa Fe where it's really kind of hard to define the edges of the property. So an illustration of that would something like this, where we can bring in a pitched roof, can clearly define the parking lot. We can create a streetscape, extend sidewalks and crosswalks, create direct connections from the sidewalk along the street to the front property line, bring in property to the rear, of course, landscape everything, build in some amenities to the site. And this would be kind of a retrofit of an existing building where the building can stay where it is, but it could be kind of redevelop, if you will, the site to bring in some of the types of improvements that could be in the land use code. Just looking at it from a perspective, if there is parking in the front, it would be limited. So in other words, the buildings would probably have a minimum or a maximum setback rather than a minimum setback, so that it only accommodates one or maybe two bays of parking in the front that would be heavily landscaped and screened from the street. This is the frontage that is an example of a corner where the building is brought to the front and to the side street. There is an expanse of green along the street frontage with the parking well landscaped to the side and to the rear of the property. This is how a drive-through could be accommodated. Again, with screening along that drive-through, have building improvements to cover that. So there are a number of different ways that could be handled, but trying to do it sensitively so that it's well designed for circulation, but also thinking about the character and the aesthetic. A couple more quick last two polling questions here. Questions 14 and 15. So those are now posted, ready for your response. Okay, about half complete. About another 5 seconds here. Couple more dribbling in, 5 more seconds. Here we go. And the results. So this is very clear that Littleton Boulevard presents a much different character than do the other major arteries in town. So looking at slope roofs to be most important along that corridor. And then as to pitched roofs along the corridors anyway, in downtown, we looked at them as being important, but along the corridors, it's viewed as being less important as long as the buildings and sites are well designed and landscaped and buildings are located properly. So those are very clear answers. Very, very good. All right. Continue through the presentation here so we can try to cover as much as we can. This would be an example of a center. It's busy, but basically breaking buildings down into smaller pieces. They would require kind of design on all sides since they'd be, fronting a street, having well landscaped parking lots with lots of interior and perimeter landscaping, making sure that there's pedestrians that are accounted for rather than just the automobile. There's no transit per se along this particular property. and starting to make sure that there are active links to the greenways so that sites are built and figure those greenway areas into the site design as opposed to turning their back on them. Just a perspective view of that. And here we're starting to look at ways that we can integrate some low impact development things like great rain gardens, basically depressions where stormwater can run off. They can be very attractive. Having a linear bioswale along that where we sink the the land and have all the runoff as part of the stormwater for the site, managing it and helping to water trees and landscaping. Again, using articulating buildings and building components well. So here are some examples of some low impact type of development improvements that are growing in their popularity and implementation in cities all across. This would be an example of a rain garden on the left. The upper right would be the different ways of doing swales, again, for stormwater runoff, but make them vegetated and attractive, and then being able to use grasscrete or kind of a green paving. Wanted to show an example of mixed use. I think many of you are familiar with this property at Bellevue on the south side between Irving and Federal, showing how that could be built out as a mixed use development that could be phased over time. There is transit that comes to the corner of Bellevue and Federal. So thinking of that corner being transit oriented, basically providing near access to a variety of uses, whether that's restaurants, retail, people coming to work, etc. Having a parking garage that is wrapped by outside uses so that the garage is not apparent. And over time, this could build out into subsequent phases, starting to bring in different housing elements so we can meet different affordability needs across the community. Some live work, introducing large public space for outdoor areas and programming, and then ultimately building out the site. So if you recall, we talked about what mixed use is and what are some of the elements that help bring that together. It's a variety of different uses, thinking about how they relate to transit, usually within a quarter-mile walking distance of transit stops, providing for a range of both commercial and residential, making sure that everything's more on a grid with smaller blocks so that it's highly walkable, and making attractive streetscapes and comfortable streetscapes for people so that we can move back and forth between existing neighborhoods and being sensitive to the types of and scales of buildings that are across the street from existing residential neighborhoods. So that's a quick example of showing a mixed use property. And one other would be an infill project. This is at the corner of Broadway and Ridge Road. Again, building out in phases. And I just want to make sure that everybody's understanding that these are purely conceptual, nothing proposed on the table, but just to help illustrate how properties could be re-envisioned and redeveloped. For instance, this building here on the corner, you might see Andy's Custard in a little different space, maybe on a bottom floor with some upper floor residential or something. So existing uses can, still be very viable and part of these developments. And of course, in many cases, some of those buildings are built around and over time might transition. But the idea here is that, we're not scraping a site or pushing anybody out. This is just conceptual as to how they might develop. So just a last reminder that we have the envisionlittleton.org site. Again, this presentation will all be posted so you can refer to that or refer others to that. We had set aside the last bit of this presentation. Looks like we have about 25 minutes remaining as just kind of an open forum. So Brian, if you could please allow people to share basically their mics, their voices, as well as if there are any other typed notes that people want to make. We will open it up at this time for any thoughts, comments, observations, preferences, what you saw, how you like it, what you maybe didn't see. So it looks
Yes,
like,
this is Kent Bagley.
okay,
And one of my comments would be in reference to your floor area ratio reductions.
okay,
I think that they're in some cases pretty severe. And I would say, especially where the FAR was existing at 3 and it dropped to 0.7, I think. So, I mean, I'm concerned about the reduction in the floor area ratio, and consequently, with a lot of what's being done here, the whole issue of takings. If I own one of these properties and you are vastly reducing the development potential of that property by the new zoning, it's effectively a taking. So those are the two concerns that I have.
great. I appreciate that. Very well said.
Kent's concerns. Absolutely echo every single one of those concerns.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
I also agree.
Very good. The floor area ratio, I'm not sure how those were selected at the time the zoning ordinance was written. We will absolutely look at those and look at the appropriateness of them and the context of them. We know that, in some cases, building height is of concern, not as much in other locations. The amount of parking that's required for different uses and the amount of green space all contribute to that. So in some cases, unless you want to allow for really tall buildings, the FAR just simply cannot be achieved if they're going to meet the parking on the site. But we will certainly be looking at the amount of parking that's now required. As in most communities, parking ratios have been very liberal and have been requiring more parking than what's actually needed. So we'll be working through all those numbers and continuing to calibrate, but I greatly appreciate you bringing that point and all the agreement to that. I see we have a couple of hands in the air from Patrick and Susan.
Well, I can go first. I didn't see any bike lane on Littleton Boulevard, and it's really difficult to bike that. Well, it's difficult to bike Bellevue, Broadway, and Littleton, but I think Littleton just needs more attention for a bike lane.
Okay. And we say bike lane, are you thinking on street? Within the right of way?
Or change the right now, the sidewalk is not very wide and there's a lot of pedestrians on it. So it's not a very fun experience for anybody to bike on the sidewalk. So
Okay.
I'm thinking bike lane on the road.
Probably some sort of separated bike lane would be best. And
Yeah.
I agree with what Kent's concern about takings.
Okay,
We have
perfect.
to be careful about that.
Absolutely.
This is Patrick Santana. Can I go next?
You bet.
A few things. I think a 30-foot height limit on Littleton Boulevard seems awfully low for a 70-foot wide street. So much of the overarching community interest in Littleton is for a more walkable, bikeable neighborhood. And these very wide streets with low-rise buildings, especially, or no buildings and parking lots, encourage a sense of freeway, highwayness, that the automobile dominates it. And so I would, and likewise, the greatly restricted FARs mean more parking, less building. With large boulevards and corridors, I would like to see, it would be better if the buildings were larger and closer to the streets, in my opinion, because they create a more enclosed space and begin to reduce the size and scale of the cars relative to the architecture. I also wanted to note that there was a Littleton Boulevard corridor study completed a few years ago, and it explicitly stated in section 1A2 that we should avoid locating parking between buildings, building frontage, and a street or open space. That's a direct quote. So it seems to me that what you're proposing here is a lot of the illustrations throw out stuff in the corridor study, which was that the buildings should not have parking between street and building. This creates a sort of mini mall structure, which is anti-walkability, anti-pedestrian, because it means cars are coming in and out of lots, and it just makes it look like a car parking lot along walkable areas. Pedestrians have to cross 30, 40 feet to get to the doors. So just in general, I find some of that very problematic, and you're contravening the Boulevard study, the corridor study in Littleton Boulevard alone. Just wanted to point
Yeah,
that out.
so we're aware of that corridor study and aware of that sentiment and included in that study. That's why we have provided different frontage types. Some of the graphics that we show illustrated just that of keeping.
I know,
the
but almost every illustration on Littleton Boulevard had car parking between sidewalk and building frontage.
Yeah.
Almost every single one, if you go back.
Of the existing photos, you mean, or aerial photos?
Oh, they were drawings at the frontage, the slides that were frontage study slides. And this is a particularly germane topic to how we relate boulevards along these
Yes.
corridors to the buildings. And your illustrations had parking on every single one, which if you look at the corridor study, and even some of the plan drawings you showed of the mixed use buildings on some of these corridors, there's often just trees and the building frontage, the very large scale ones. But the illustrations shown had driveways and parking in front of between frontage and buildings.
Okay, other comments?
I think Patrick makes really good points. This is Pat Cronenberger. And also in talking about Littleton Boulevard, I would question our premises a little bit about the housing the structures that are more residential, because the old transition zone was considered a catch-all kind of junk zone. Nobody knew what to do with it. In the olden days, you're talking about the late 70s, early 80s, when nobody valued Littleton Boulevard and those old residential structures. So they were converting them to commercial use, but keeping the residential structure, which really isn't, it was a sign of how inconsequential people thought the potential for Littleton Boulevard was in those days, and there was a certain sort of demeaning of the whole boulevard. So I also think that you have to look at the residential structures that are west of Windermere in a very different way from the few that exist east of Windermere, that are almost, they're odd. They don't fit anymore in what's predominantly going on, which is mainly commercial and business and some retail.
Great points. Thank you.
This is Rick.
Okay.
Can I go next, Rick Cronenberger? I also want to agree with Patrick Stein, Brett. Many of the mid-century modern structures on Littleton Boulevard, not many of them, some of them do not have parking in front. A lot of the buildings are set back, particularly at the eastern end where Pat and I live. I also feel that some of the discussion on Littleton Boulevard is not really addressing the historical significance of all the mid-century modern structures that we have, which is the largest concentration, of course, in the metropolitan area, if not the state, and something that Littleton really wants to showcase. So we want to do as much as we can to protect these buildings. We've already lost 2 of them just within the last week up at the corner of Littleton Boulevard and Broadway. And the mid-century modern buildings, which were all built over a 10 or 15-year period, sets the setback requirements for Littleton Boulevard. And I think you had mentioned that once before in the earlier meeting in the spring. What was interesting about Littleton Boulevard was that 20-foot setback for residential and commercial as it as you go all the way up the street. A few buildings sit close, but most of them are in that 20-foot setback.
Okay. I see a hand, but I don't see a name. So if you want to.
It's Dan Radulovich. It seemed that mixed use came up in pretty much every corridor that we had. I just want to make sure that it doesn't get used as a silver bullet to try and cure every ail that we have. I just don't know how effective it would be if we just did everything mixed use along corridor. I don't know how well that would work. One of the other things about bike lanes along Littleton Boulevard, I think we actually need to put bike lanes on streets that are adjacent to it, rather than trying to mess with anything on Littleton Boulevard. I think trying to do that on you're going to have to buy a lot of property probably if you're going to keep the median. If you're going to keep 2 lanes there, there's going to be a lot of things that you're going to have to do, and that's just my personal take on that. So I think looking at adjacent streets such as Powers, I know that there's been one proposed along there, and that's a better option in my opinion, because I think it becomes a safety issue at some point.
What about just using the parking lane? It's three lanes wide in some places simply because there's a right turn lane pocket, but almost every single structure on that street, new developments certainly will have parking. So we could take all the parking off of that street for protected bike lanes and get more people using it. That's the vision, right?
Are you talking about the strictly downtown or the eastern part of Littleton Boulevard? Because there's no parking in front of any of those places on the street that I can think of.
In front of the Circle K and 7-Eleven, then there's an 18-foot right lane then. Maybe there's no legal parking, but there's really wide lanes. One's really wide. Bike lanes should be located in the same way, in my opinion. I'm going to contradict you here. We have a single east-west axis on Littleton, and bike lanes should be aligned with car traffic. There's a reason drivers want to use those thoroughfares, and there'll be the same reason for bike. You have a complex neighborhood network of cul-de-sacs and non-through streets when you move off of the main corridor. We see people biking on the sidewalk all the time on Littleton because it's an unsafe corridor on the street. And it's a 75-foot road at places. There is no possible way that the eastern section of Littleton Boulevard could not incorporate bike lanes safely there's no need. I disagree that we should move them off to neighborhood streets.
I would have to see a design work up on that. And then you're depending on all this stuff.
You acknowledge it's a very large street, very large. And there are streets much smaller than that throughout the Denver region.
It's also a major connector for all the auto traffic that comes through there. Okay.
Focusing on the auto traffic is not the walkable, bikeable concerns that the community is all of Envision Littleton has raised. That's the reverse of what we've been struggling here to create.
Like I said, I would have to see design work up, and I would have to see what you're depending on new development doing that. And I don't know if I think it's going to be a lot harder than just saying it personally.
We don't get to design the roads.
Yeah, your points are well taken. We appreciate them. Just want to keep in mind, we're drafting the zoning ordinance. So, some of the design detailing, to that level, we won't be getting into, but it's always important that we hear your perspectives. So I know those are important to the community.
And I make a comment. There's been a lot of discussion about bike lanes. Both Dan Radulovich and I serve on the Littleton Transportation Mobility Board, and we are looking at the issue of bike lanes. And probably the biggest thing to note is that Powers to the north, 1 block north of Littleton Boulevard, is in the present bike lane system. And probably the biggest issue is better signage, better ability to designate and let people know where bike lanes are throughout the city. It's not adequate at the present time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
This is Dan. Sorry, this is Dan Flynn, if I may speak in.
Please do.
Thank you.
I'd like to mention that if the residential uses along Broadway are to be reconsidered at any point, which I'm hoping there'll be more study done before that happens, but if they're being reconsidered, I think the community is better served by including the properties that abut those to the west from the stated goals that Kathleen was talking about in terms of transportation, safety, economic development, and so on. I think considering that whole section of homes back to the next road opens up a lot more opportunities and better conversations. I think the whole thing should be looked at more closely, but if they are going to be considered, we should consider the abutting homes as well.
So basically increasing the depth of lots along the Broadway frontage by taking in property to the next street. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it would have that effect, and it would open that back street for reducing access requirements onto Broadway. All of the traffic could go out the back street, Crestview and Fairview, whatever those are.
Okay, appreciate that. See a couple hands that are maybe left over, or maybe they're new, I'm not sure. You want to speak up if you'd like to speak, please?
Bob Schwinn, you want to go? Bob, you're muted.
No. Can't hear him.
Bob, we can't hear you. I do believe we've opened the chat as well, if you want to put questions in the chat.
It's still disabled, the chat.
Brian, can you go ahead and enable that again?
Yeah, I thought I had tried, I thought I had done that, but let me work.
I think that chat should be working now. If someone can just confirm that they can pull that up.
Still not available.
It is.
No.
Okay,
I can see it.
Okay.
We still can't hear Bob, so let's go on to Carol B.
Hi. Okay, so I do have a question. It's not really a question, it's more of a comment, but the voting that was done earlier, it seems to me like people are voting on areas that they aren't directly involved with or don't live near or don't have a business near. And so I'm concerned about reading too much into the actual percentages that we're voting for different things in areas that they may not be directly impacted by. And so the areas that, one area that I would be concerned about is the Santa Fe, the South Santa Fe corridor. And it just seemed like, you know, that area, it sort of echoes what Pat said earlier about Littleton Boulevard and the way it was perceived. You know, historically, I think Santa Fe has been perceived as sort of the dumping ground for things that people didn't want in their area. And so I'm sort of seeing that again, playing out again along that corridor with the added pressure of the CDOT Pell project that's moving forward. And so I'm not hearing anything about those impacts. And then when I see, well, okay, well, let's just convert this whole thing to mixed use without understanding, well, how is that going to be impacted by whatever CDOT does, the surrounding residential areas, which include single family homes, townhomes, and apartment buildings. And so that would be a concern of mine, is that whatever the vote meant to however the vote's going to be used that was done during this session, it's sort of skewed. I mean, there's some bias attached to it because it's just not reflective of, you know, the people that live in those areas or work in or own property in those areas. So that's my comment.
Okay, appreciate that.
Can I rebut that a little bit? This is Karen Dana. I totally hear you I also think that though we have a vested interest in what's happening within our community, whether or not we are, living right there on the corridor, we live here, we work here, our kids go to school here. So we have a vested interest in property values. We have vested interest in what's happening within our community. So, and we're participating in these sessions to have our voice heard. So I don't know if there's any further opportunity to kind of pull the people that are going to be directly impacted by this stuff. But I don't, I don't know if it's being skewed in a bad way. We're just invested in what's happening within our community.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to agree to disagree on that one.
Okay. Any other verbal comments? Looks like we've got about 2 minutes remaining. I know we've got a hard deadline from follow-up meeting. I'd just like to thank everybody for participating, spending your time, giving us your thoughts and comments is very important for us. So these will all be utilized as we are drafting. And of course, you're all going to be able to vet the regulations when they're drafted too. So it's the last opportunity you have, obviously. So Kathleen or Jennifer, was there anything that you wanted to say in closing?
I just wanted to thank everyone for their participation this evening. I'd send out my apologies. Looks like we had some challenges with getting login instructions out to folks. So I know some people joined us a little late. We have recorded the session. I'll make sure that all those that were registered have a copy of that. I don't know, Brett or Brian, do you think that the recording I might have today, then hopefully we can get it posted in the next couple of days. So again, my apologies if that was something that happened on your end and you had any trouble logging in with instructions today. And then I just I love all the feedback that we've gotten this evening and really appreciate that. And we continue to use all of the feedback that we've gotten through this Envision process, particularly being guided by that future land use and character map. And it becomes such an important tool for us to incorporate as we step through this process.
All right. Thank you all once again. We appreciate it. Please look to the website for any final comments and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you for joining.